Hello and welcome to Traditional Painting the Digital Way. This is where I use digital painting apps to teach traditional painting techniques. In this series, we're looking at how to make a painting less busy and to add depth to it. And this is part 2 in my Forest Path series. And if you want to follow along with traditional materials, check out part 1 in this series where I have a list of all the brushes and the paints and the canvases that I use. The app that I'm going to be using is Infinite Painter for Android. And here we're going to finish adding some more leaves in the middle ground. And again, we want to make the trees in the middle ground just a little bit darker than the ones in the background that are going to be lighter and more faded out from the atmospheric perspective and the mist that's in the air. So here I'm just using burnt umber. If you're following along traditionally, you can use your number 6 filbert or number 4 flat brush, just something that you can make some fairly straight lines. But again, the trees are not completely straight. They don't look like telephone poles or electric poles. They're kind of bent, they're kind of warped, so they're going to be not completely straight. And so the trees that are over here on the left side are in the foreground, and they're going to be the closest. And so they're going to be the darkest in color and the most intense. So you can use burnt umber with a touch of ultramarine blue in it if you're following on traditionally. You just want kind of a darker brown color, not black, but you do want a darker brown here. And so I'm just kind of adding in those trees, and then I've gone back and I'm adding a little bit lighter color of the trees in the middle ground just to give it more depth, to show a little bit more detail. But again, this painting is all about leaving detail out instead of adding too much detail. Too much detail in the background destroys the 3D look of your paintings. If you add too much detail in the back, it will flatten it out and your painting won't look three-dimensional and it won't look real. It'll just look kind of flat and it'll be hard to tell what's going on in the painting. So here I'm adding a little bit more of the light leaves that are going to be hit by the sunlight, and they're in the foreground and they're going to be brighter. And you can use phthalo yellow green, and I'm using the Pollock brush, the Jackson, it's named after Jackson Pollock, I think. And so the Pollock brush, I like it because it gives a real fluffy, jagged look that looks like an indication of leaves. And again, we're not doing individual leaves here because this is the middle ground, and you don't want big, jagged detail in the middle ground. You want kind of a sort of an impressionistic look. We're not going totally impressionistic, but we give it enough detail that it looks real and can trick the eye into thinking that it's real. That's sort of the secret of how you paint. Just enough detail that it looks like it's real, and the eye and the brain will say, oh, that's a leaf, and it'll go ahead and just finish it out in your mind. And so that's what I'm doing right here with the darker green. I'm adding some darker greens. You need that contrast. You've got to have the contrast of the light against the dark. That's what painting is all about. You've got to have contrast in order to give it depth and to make things show up. Otherwise, things are just too light and they won't show up. And again, that flattens your painting out and you don't get a three-dimensional look here. So there are several factors to making a painting look three-dimensional, you have to have aerial perspective in it, and you've got to also know when to leave the detail out and when to add details in the front. And like here, I'm adding some branches now on the trees because these trees are in the front. So you want more detail on the things in the front so that it gives you the three-dimensional look here. This is part of the painting magic, is adding the details to the things right in the front and in the foreground. And I'm adding some branches. I'm taking a really thin brush, and you can use your script liner brush if you're following along traditionally, and and add a lot of water to your dark mixture of paint, probably burnt umber, and just make real thin lines. And so that's what I'm doing here. And then in Infinite Painter, just turn down the size of the brush to very thin, and you can probably use a filbert or the old oil brush for this. And so I'm just kind of adding the details to the trees in the front, and it's already starting to give it a three-dimensional look because it's looking more detailed in the front, just like if you were standing on the path looking at it. The things that are next to you, you're going to be able to see very clearly, and then the things that are far off are going to look more indistinct and lighter in color. So here I'm just adding a few more branches and leaves, and I want to add some of the darker leaves, and what I'm doing is putting down the first layer of a darker green so that I can go ahead and add the lighter green color to those leaves, and so that it looks like it's being hit by a sunbeam and the edge of the trees are lit up. And so I'm using Hooker's green with a little bit of white acrylic gesso if you're following along traditionally, and you can go ahead and use your bristle brush to make the leaves. Again, this is sort of the middle ground, and we don't want them real distinct looking. And then here I want to go ahead and add the lighter color now, and this will give the indication that the light is hitting the edge of the trees, that the sunbeams are shining through the trees, and so it gives a sort of a lit up edge light effect, but leave some of the things in the darkness so that you have that contrast. So that's what I'm working on, trying to get the form of the branches and how they hang out over the path, and that will also give it the three-dimensional look when you put your branches hanging out over your pathway. So I'm working on that, trying to add a little bit more of the dark back into the leaves, trying to get that contrast. Keep that contrast. You want the dark and the light there. And so I'm trying to just get the shapes of the leaves and how they hang down and how they cover over the back of the trees. And I'm putting a little bit of darker color in the back again to make it look like it's kind of a tunnel, and that there's a lighted path at the end of the tunnel of the trees, and that also gives it a lot of depth. And so you just want to kind of work back and forth a little bit on the leaves and the branches and try to get the shapes here. Here I am adding some more light, and I'm using I think this is a Svetlana brush. Anyway, one that will give me a splatter look. I'm using sort of the splatter brushes, and that just kind of gives it a little bit more of a look of individual leaves. Now we kind of can add a little bit of some individual leaves close to in the foreground, and that just adds the detail in the foreground and gives the painting more depth. But again, you just want to add these to the leaves in the front. You don't want to do that to the leaves in the back, because if all the leaves in the back are the same, or they're all individually detailed, it just flattens your painting out, and you don't have any three-dimensional depth to it. So you want to just kind of do this on the leaves that are closest to you and closest to the viewer's eye. So here I'm just working on adding some of that onto the right on the very edges of the leaves. And these will be even brighter right on the edges. So I wanted to use some more of the splatter brushes and just try to get that look of individual leaves right on the edges of the trees where the sunbeams are just catching the edge there and lighting them up. And that just adds more interest and more depth to your painting. So this is the end of part 2 of my Forest Path series. And in part 3, we're going to continue working on the road and add some more underbrush to the trees around it. So if you want to see that, hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments down below, and I will catch you later.